Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the CIArb PolicyCast. My name is Johnston. I'm Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Institute. And in this series, we explore some of the most pressing issues in the world of dispute resolution today. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by John Howell MP. John has been the Member of Parliament for Henley since 2008. He serves as chair of the APPG for ADR, so that is a very heavy number of acronyms there, but that is the all-party parliamentary group for alternative dispute resolution. And he is the UK trade envoy to Nigeria. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Now, today we're going to be discussing how ADR is on the political agenda. And in particular, some of the work that John has been doing with his colleagues in Westminster to promote the use of ADR as an alternative to litigation, primarily here in the UK, but also some of the global dimensions to that. So firstly, John, could you start by just telling me a little bit about what first interested you in alternative dispute resolution and why you wanted to get that on the political agenda?
Well, I think it's an incredibly important concept. If you look at what it can potentially offer, it can offer speed in resolving issues. It can offer cheapness in resolving issues. Although perhaps that's a subject that we can come back to. But I think more importantly, it can also change the mindset of the British people, where if a dispute comes up, they want to rush to court. Either for a judicial review or for some other action in the High Court, and this is a much better way of getting to resolve the problem between individuals. One of the things that I'm personally very keen on is seeing more use of, for example, mediation in the planning system. Because that is something that is ferociously expensive, and if there was more mediation used in the planning system, I think it would go a long way to helping the situation. So I think what I've been trying to do with the all-party parliamentary group is to take a different aspect of politics, a different aspect of government, and to explore how ADR can be used in that. Now, when we talk about ADR, we're not limiting it to any particular topic, but whether that's arbitration, mediation, or conflict avoidance, it's right across the board, and to find what fits where. And I think that's very, very important because for reasons that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, I think that the ADR profession needs to be much broader than it is at the moment.
Absolutely, thank you, John. I think you explained there about some of the unique selling points, as it were, of ADR, and why it is a viable alternative to litigation. Do you think there are certain ways in which you would like to see that develop so that it can perhaps better live up to that that ambition and that potential? And are there things that we can do as professional institutions, and that perhaps you can do as part of the policy making apparatus to bring that about?
Well, I think actually one of the major changes that needs to take place is at your end. It's in how the profession organises itself, and I'm very conscious that it's a profession that has fallen, if I can put it this way, fallen into the hands of the lawyers, who are seen as the only people that can arbitrate and the only people, particularly, that can mediate. And I think that is very unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate bit for cost reasons, but I think it's very unfortunate for bringing the experience that you want to resolve the disputes. The whole point of ADR is to resolve disputes. And to make sure that people come out better off on both sides. It may be a compromise solution, but they come off better on both sides for doing this. Now, if I can sell myself a bit in this, I mean, MPs do this as a natural part of their job. I mean, that's what they're doing all the time for constituents. And it seemed to me that if we couldn't get a case made for ADR in Parliament through the APG, then nobody could. And I'm determined that we should do that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting point, and I think there are some real parallels between the skills required in the Westminster bear pit, as it were, and often the same skills that are needed to unpick a quite thorny dispute. Do you think that, particularly in the UK perspective, I'm thinking we're speaking at a time when it's 3 months since the lockdown of some form was imposed in the UK and indeed around the world. And we've seen a lot of adaptation on the back of that. You've seen it certainly in Parliament with remote voting at one point and various other kind of innovations that had to be put in place. We've seen it at the Chartered Institute with greater use of remote proceedings for hearings, and indeed we produced guidance to try and assist the profession in making that shift in early April. Do you have much hope that you think that the disruption and the subsequent innovations that have stemmed from that might help the profession make some changes that may actually strengthen it in the long run, and perhaps help it reconfigure in some of the ways that you've just described?
Well, that's an interesting idea, because I'm absolutely sure that when we go back to a normal, it's not going to be completely back to the normal that we had. There's going to be an element of taking what we've learned in this period with us. But you know, if you think of a mediation, for example, I mean, you certainly can help to do that online. But ultimately, it's the relationship that you're building with the individuals. You want to actually look somebody in the eye and to be able to make a judgment about them. And that's one of the key skills that it seems to me comes out in being a good mediator. And you can't do that remotely. Personally, I don't believe that can be done remotely. So I'm looking forward to a return to some form of normality there. And I think that leads on to an interesting question, because we not only have the pandemic that is shaping the attitude of the profession towards the public, we also have Brexit running at exactly the same time. And of course, that if we want to maintain London as a centre for dispute resolution, then we have to do things to try and make ourselves much more competitive. I mean, the trip that we had to Singapore last year was very good in being able to explore what the Singapore government had done to encourage mediation and arbitration to continue, and there was a lot of effort put into that. Here in London, well, you know, the effort is looking a bit ropey at the moment, and if you look, for example, at the places in which dispute resolution takes place, it's comparing chalk and cheese between London and Singapore. So unless we take up that issue, unless we look to bridge that gap that there is internationally, I think we're going to find it a difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point, and I think our fact-finding trip to Singapore last year did draw out a lot of those issues about what it is that makes a successful disputes hub. Obviously, at the moment, I think, you know, London still retains a leading status in that regard. And obviously, at the Institute, we're a global organisation, and we think that a thriving dispute sector anywhere in the world is good for everywhere in the world. I think there are so there were some quite key themes that came out of that trip to Singapore, and now might be a useful point at which to delve into some of those, perhaps in a bit more detail. Obviously, we have the report coming up fairly soon. We're ready to launch that. In fact, the first day that lockdown was imposed, so that may need to be updated somewhat in light of what's happened. But it obviously covered a lot of ground, and I wondered if you'd want to tell some of our viewers about what your first impressions from that were.
Well, I'd like to start by following your remarks on the launch of the report. You know, it's brilliant that we went, and it's brilliant that we saw what we did and got the information back from it. But it's no use just keeping that to ourselves. We've got to get that out, and whether we do that through some sort of remote apparatus, or whether we wait for the lockdown to completely end, I don't think that's a choice for us. I think we just need to get it out as quickly as possible. Now, one of the most interesting points for me was the role that Singapore was taking. I mean, with the mediation convention to try and make sure that mediation was that the results for mediation were acceptable and followed through in different parts of the world. I understand that the UK government hasn't signed that convention yet, but I would urge it to sign it as quickly as possible. And I think what that shows is an ambition on the part of the Singapore government, not just for the Far East, but globally, to be able to take this forward and to develop the profession. Now, here the profession is very much limited in terms of what it can do at the big level. But you know, if you look down into what is going on at the lower level, there is a lot of mediation going on. For example, you know, I've undertaken mediation within my own constituency to help communities to be able to negotiate a new relief road for their village. And there's a classic piece of mediation work. And unless we tell people that we're doing that, it's not going to be picked up. And I think that, you know, that's where my remarks about this being too limited in terms of the people who are mediators and arbitrators is a very relevant distinction. And the conversations that we had with the Chief Justice of Singapore were absolutely superb. It's very rare, even in this country, to meet a politician, and I say that with a great deal of humility. But it's very rare to meet a politician or a judge with the insights that he had to this, and he was really switched on for making sure that Singapore took its place in the world on that, and that's what we need in the UK as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think there was one of the most striking features of all of the discussions that we had in Singapore was just how holistically policy was conceived, and so there were no isolated initiatives. It was very much seen as part of a whole package that would then help build the jurisdiction up as a hub for disputes. One of the main elements of that, I think, that we saw that's taken place over the last sort of 2 to 3 decades was introducing mediation at every level, as you described. So the mediation convention is perhaps the culmination of that in terms of the mediation of major international commercial disputes. And we were told how it was hoped that the convention would be a bit of a rallying cry for that. Perhaps at a lower level, as you've described, mediation has a role to play across a whole host of different disputes. And you mentioned earlier in your opening remarks about the role that it could play in the planning system, and you've also talked about your very specific experience with the relief road. Could you expand a bit on what you think could be done to introduce mediation and how it could perhaps change the whole culture of planning in this country?
Well, it's not just planning. I mean, planning is a very good example of this. But what the All-Party Parliamentary Group has been doing has been going through different areas and exploring where mediation and arbitration have been used. And for example, the police force use ADR a lot in settling disputes that they have. Did we know about that? Well, we did through the APPG, but I'm not sure that the people outside know much about that. So there is a lot of ADR that is going on that is not being picked up. Now, do individual people know about the benefits that ADR can bring? Do we know that they are using it in their disputes? Well, we know that it is going on. And I have spoken to practitioners that are trying to do this at a community level to try and get some purchase for ADR on this. But I don't think its use, I don't think its knowledge is wide enough to be able to be able to take that forward. But you know, if this comes back to the benefits that it can bring. And the benefits are there for everyone to see for themselves. And one of the things that I am particularly personally very much involved in is planning, as you pointed out, and the enormous benefits that I can see there are that many of the disputes that we get into are to put it mildly, down to the bloody-mindedness of one side or the other. But a lot of them are not that. A lot of them, they just fall into litigation because it seems to be the only alternative. Well, it's not the only alternative. And there are a number of us who are involved in this area who have personal experience of how it can be taken forward and the enormous benefit that can bring in terms of getting a dispute settled. Now, examples of where that can be used are quite go right across the planning system, but they can start right at the beginning in trying to put a local plan together, which district councils are under a great deal of pressure to do as quickly as possible. Now, and I think mediation can play a very large role in helping to do that. So I really do see enormous benefits for this right across the sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the another area that we've become acutely aware of recently is access to redress for perhaps smaller and medium-sized enterprises. Now, this is obviously been an issue for the long predates the pandemic. But the pandemic has perhaps brought it into quite sharp relief that for a certain category of business, litigation is prohibitively expensive, and they need some form of avenue to settle a dispute if necessary. And I think the key thing is having a whole range of different mechanisms available that can best meet their needs, whether that's arbitration, mediation, or some form of facilitated negotiation. Last week, in fact, the Institute launched, in collaboration with CEDA, a new initiative and a new service designed to achieve exactly that. I wondered if, based on your own experience as a member of Parliament, and also given your background in business, whether you have any particular thoughts on the commercial imperatives facing business decision makers when they're faced with a dispute, and how we can better accommodate those.
Well, I think that is a very, very good point, and I think it comes back to a question of costs, at least in part, but it also comes back to a question of time. The courts have a huge backlog, particularly now after the pandemic, and it's going to take ages to move things through the courts. Whereas you can get things settled much more quickly through ADR. Now, I think that it's really important because I've been involved in a mediation between a foreign state and a company from the Nordic areas. That's great, but it doesn't actually affect the attitude of small and medium-sized businesses to look on ADR as a positive contribution that they can make to their own activities. Yet there is a tremendous amount of opportunity there, and I think that there are some companies who are looking at how they can resolve that. You know, we have a huge number of ombudsmen that have been set up, and to a certain extent, you know, they are effective. But in those sort of situations, if a much more formal type of ADR was put together, I think that would have a much better effect and would allow SMEs the availability of time to be able to get their issue in front of somebody and resolved in front of somebody. And often, you know, this goes to the heart of what mediation is about. You know, it's not about somebody telling you; it's about you agreeing yourselves. And very few businesses when they sit down, you know, they all come in with their arms crossed and, you know, well, you know, we've got right on our side. And the technique is to get them to agree. Well, you know, maybe there is a compromise here. Maybe there is a compromise, and maybe this guy or this woman knows exactly how to reach that compromise and get it out. And I think the more we can see that in play, the better.
Absolutely, and I think it really comes back to that issue of choice and options for businesses, because no two disputes are exactly the same, and I think in certain instances, perhaps all they need is a bit of a nudge to come to an agreement themselves through mediation, as you described. And other times, perhaps they want the certainty that will come from an arbitrator reviewing the case and then making a decision on that basis. So it's important that those different avenues are open, and I think we can only ever benefit from always broadening those options and making them available to more and more people.
But one thing. Just sorry to interrupt you. But one thing I think that it's important to recognise here, that it's really important to avoid the conflict starting in the first place. And the more we can put in place the structures to be able to stop that happening, the better off we will all be. And that's why the initiatives to try and put together conflict avoidance boards is music to my ears. I mean, if we can, we all know that on a big computer project or a big building project, there is always going to be the possibility for disputes coming up at some stage in this. If you can get that sorted out at the beginning, then you can stop those disputes becoming real conflicts and sort them out. And there's a skill in being able to do that I think that many companies should be looking at.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned conflict avoidance, in fact, John. I think that prevention is always better than cure. And if you can draw on the expertise that the neutrals have, particularly if they've got a background in the industry in question, and they understand the dynamics of projects, then yes, they can anticipate where a problem may arise before it does. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Just in terms of what we've got coming up, obviously you've spoken about some of the work of the APPG, both in terms of examining what makes an effective global disputes hub and the trip to Singapore, and specifically the work on ADR in the planning system. Are there any particular areas that you would like to explore more, do you think, over the coming months, once the Singapore report is released and we're able to actually work on the basis of that to make some of those changes that that are being called for? What other areas would you like to investigate, do you think?
Well, just before we move on from that, I think there ought to be a tremendous amount of fallout from the Singapore report. Mm-hmm. We really need to hit home with that, because at its heart is the protection of London and the UK as a whole, and as a global centre for arbitration. So that was the important point for why we went there, and that's the important point that we've got to bring out. Other areas where we can work on. I think there probably is a lot still more to do on planning in this to try and get that accepted. But I think I would like to expand the work that we've done out to, for example, the Cabinet Office, because they are responsible for looking at big projects. And if government doesn't believe that it is going to end up with the same problems that the big developers are already ending up with, then it is completely blind. And so it needs to tackle the conflict avoidance boards as part of the contracts that it is operating. But I do think that there is an all-party parliamentary group on every disease known to man, on every country known to man. But I think that what is important about the ADR, all-party parliamentary group, and I know you might say, I would say this anyway, wouldn't you, is that it is incredibly busy. It runs a very good and very, very well attended series of meetings in Westminster, and it does bring out a lot of these points. What we have to do is to find ways of moving them out into the individual departments to make sure that they are picked up and that they are used. And that, I don't underestimate the challenge there, because the lawyers, if I can have a little attack on lawyers, the lawyers are everywhere pushing for a litigated solution to problems. I think we've got to push for an ADR-based solution to problems right across the board, and there's no point in doing this half-hearted. We've got to really go for it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely right, and I think we've already demonstrated the value of the APPG on various different projects, and I think it's really able to live up to its mission of promoting and encouraging greater use of ADR. But in order to really make that concrete, you're absolutely right. It needs to be getting into where the decisions are made in individual departments, and that has to specifically, I think, it has to go far beyond the Ministry of Justice. And reach into the business department, the Cabinet Office, and beyond. So I thoroughly agree there.
A little while ago, I became an associate of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and I'm going to take another of your courses shortly. I sincerely hope. But when I became an associate, the murmurings in the Department of Justice were quite loud. Of oh my God, what's he done now? Why has he done this? And it is an important sign that of a way that we want to travel in this business in order to get it in. And I know that the Lord Chancellor is keen to see the outcome of the Singapore report and to discuss how that can be taken forward.
Excellent. Well, that's very exciting, and we know that we want to do that as soon as possible. Before we conclude, John, obviously this conversation will be seen by members of the ADR community and indeed beyond. Is there one particular insight that you would like to share, or one thing that you would like our viewers to take away with them from this conversation?
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is to apologise to lawyers. I'm not anti-lawyer. I value the work that they can do. It's just that I want to see that broadened out. I want to see the profession broadened out much more than it has been, and I think it is going in that direction. So I think that where I would see the future going for this is the involvement not just of MPs, but there are particular skills there, and of looking for where those skills are, because I'm sure that ADR is a normal part of human existence. It's a normal part of how we deal with things, whether it's a dispute with your wife or whether it's a dispute with somebody who provides you with a service or commercial goods. But we don't actually see it in that way, and there is a lot to do to be able to change the profile of ADR so that it is understandable as a proper alternative to the man in the street.
Absolutely, I think that's a good note to end on, and what I think you've really honed in on there is the need for ADR to be a real alternative to the courts, and to really play on its unique strengths in that regard. And for that to happen, certainly it has to be comprehensible, and it has to be something that anyone can access. So yeah, I think that's a real insight. Well, John, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us for this episode. I was very eager to make sure that you were part of the PolicyCast series, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as well.
Well, thank you, Lewis. It's been great fun, if I may use that word, to be able to explore these things. One rarely gets the opportunity to do so in politics. One really rarely gets the opportunity to go into this level of detail. So I'm very pleased that you've given me the opportunity.
No problem at all. It's a pleasure, John. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone for tuning into this episode 3 of the PolicyCast. Thank you, John.